There are moments in history where a discovery is so simple, so repeatable, and so quietly powerful that it should have changed everything. Yet somehow, it didn't. Not because it failed, but because it never fit into the systems that came after. What you're about to learn sits exactly in that category. In the 18th century, long before modern pesticides, before chemical repellents, before industrial agriculture, a series of observations began to surface across Europe. Scientists, inventors, and farmers noticed something strange. When electricity interacted with soil, insects behaved differently. They didn't die in dramatic fashion. They didn't swarm and collapse. They simply stayed away. No hype, no marketing, no industry built around it. It's just repeated, documented observations that something invisible was forming a boundary insects refused to cross. This is not folklore. It's not survival myth. It's a thread running through over 250 years of experimentation, from royal laboratories to battlefield dairy farms to modern scientific studies. And today, we're going to walk through that thread carefully, separating what was proven, what was observed, and what you can actually apply in the real world. Because by the end of this, you're not just learning history, you're walking away with something you can test yourself. The first controlled experiment revealed more than anyone expected. In 1747, during Europe's early obsession with electricity, a French physicist conducted a tightly controlled experiment. 2 identical containers, same soil, same seeds, same environment. The only difference was that one received a steady electrical charge for several hours a day. As a result, everyone remembers is plant growth. The electrified seeds sprouted faster. That alone was enough to spark interest in what was later called electroculture. But buried in his notes was something far more unusual. Insects, small flies in particular, gathered freely around the normal soil. Yet when they approached the electrified container, they stopped. Not randomly, consistently. They hovered, hesitated, and turned away. No dramatic explanation followed, no grand theory, it's just a precise observation. Electricity in soil appeared to create a kind of invisible boundary. Then, like many things in early science, the observation was acknowledged and quietly ignored. A clockmaker stumbled into the same phenomenon decades later. Nearly a century passed before the idea resurfaced, this time not in a laboratory but in a workshop. In 1841, a Scottish inventor searching for a cheap power source buried 2 different metals, copper and zinc, into damp soil. When connected, they produced a small but steady electrical current. No chemicals, no acids, just earth and moisture acting as a natural conductor. This became known as an earth battery. It was practical, it powered devices. It required almost no maintenance. But again, something unexpected showed up. In the soil between those metals, certain organisms thrived. Others avoided it entirely. Biting insects in particular seemed to clear out of the area. This wasn't a controlled entomology study. It was a pattern noticed during use. But it matched the earlier observation almost perfectly. Where mild electrical activity interacted with damp soil, insects kept their distance. Farm-scale trials quietly confirmed the pattern. What makes this story harder to dismiss is that it didn't stay confined to small experiments. By the mid-1840s, landowners began applying the same principle across entire fields. Networks of buried metals were installed in agricultural land, not just to explore plant growth, but to observe overall environmental effects. Reports from that period describe something remarkable. Crop damage from insects dropped sharply. Workers in those fields noticed fewer biting insects, especially during peak evening hours when they would normally be overwhelmed. Again, no dramatic claims. No declarations of total eradication. Just consistent reductions and a noticeable behavioral shift in insect activity. And once again, the idea surfaced, and then faded. A 20th century engineer pushed the concept further than anyone before him. By the early 1920s, electroculture returned, this time on a much larger and more deliberate scale. An engineer in France designed systems that combined atmospheric electricity with ground-based metal networks. Tall structures captured electrical charge from the air, while buried conductors distributed it through the soil. The results were documented in agricultural reports at the time. Crops grew taller and stronger without synthetic fertilizers. Fields previously damaged by pests showed recovery. And, critically for this discussion, insect presence dropped dramatically. These systems weren't theoretical. They were built, sold, and used across thousands of farms. So the obvious question is this: if it worked well enough to be adopted at scale, why did it disappear? War reshaped agriculture more than any experiment ever could. To understand that, you have to step away from the fields and look at global events. The early 20th century brought two world wars that fundamentally changed industry. Factories that once produced explosives and chemical agents suddenly needed peacetime applications. Agriculture became the perfect outlet. Nitrogen compounds used in explosives became fertilizers. Chemical agents designed for warfare were reformulated into pesticides and insect repellents. These solutions had one critical advantage: they could be manufactured, packaged, sold, and resold. By contrast, an earth-based system using copper, zinc, and moisture required almost no ongoing cost. Once installed, it worked with minimal intervention. There was no supply chain to sustain. And in a world rapidly shifting toward industrial economics, that difference mattered more than effectiveness. Modern science confirms part of the puzzle with absolute clarity. Now here's where things shift from historical observation to hard scientific evidence. In 2015, controlled laboratory research demonstrated that extremely low concentrations of copper in water are lethal to mosquito larvae. Not high doses. Not toxic levels. Concentrations well below international drinking water safety limits. The mechanism is well understood. Copper ions interfere with essential biological processes inside the larvae, preventing development and leading to complete mortality. This isn't debated science. It's published, replicated, and widely accepted. On top of that, modern entomology has shown that many insects are highly sensitive to metal ions in their environment. These ions act as signals, sometimes repellent, sometimes disruptive to behavior. So now we have two solid facts. Copper in water eliminates mosquito larvae. Insects can detect and react to metal ions in their surroundings, connecting the historical observations to modern evidence. This is where everything begins to align. An earth battery, by its very nature, creates a slow electrochemical reaction. When copper and zinc sit in damp soil, ions are gradually released into the surrounding environment. That means the same system described in historical accounts is quietly producing the exact elements modern science has proven affect insect survival and behavior. The early observers didn't have the language of ions, microbiota, or electrochemistry. They simply recorded what they saw: fewer insects, altered patterns, and zones that insects avoided. Today we understand the mechanisms they couldn't explain. What this means for real-world survival and practical use? This is where the conversation shifts from history to application. If you're dealing with a survival scenario, a remote campsite, or even a backyard with heavy insect activity, you're usually relying on chemical repellents or physical barriers. But there's a third approach, one rooted in these historical patterns and supported, at least partially, by modern science. Introducing copper into standing water sources can significantly reduce mosquito breeding. That alone is a powerful practical takeaway backed by laboratory evidence. Creating mild electrochemical zones in damp soil using dissimilar metals may influence insect behavior in the surrounding area. That part is supported by historical consistency, though not fully validated under modern controlled trials. The key here is understanding the difference. One is proven. The other is strongly suggested, but not formally tested in the way modern science demands. Why this knowledge still matters today? For a serious survivalist or history enthusiast, this isn't about replacing modern tools. It's about expanding your options. History is filled with methods that were abandoned not because they failed, but because something more profitable replaced them. That doesn't make them useless. In many cases, it makes them underexplored. What stands out in this case is the consistency. Different people in different places, across different centuries, observed the same general effect under similar conditions. That doesn't guarantee success in every scenario, but it does make it worth paying attention to. It's a real takeaway and why you should test it yourself. If there's one thing history teaches over and over again, it's that observation matters just as much as theory. The individuals in this story weren't chasing trends or selling products. They were noticing patterns and recording them carefully. That's something you can still do today. Test copper in water. Observe insect behavior. Experiment with soil, moisture, and metal combinations in controlled ways. Document what happens. Because the gap between historical observation and modern validation often gets closed not by institutions, but by individuals paying attention. This is exactly the kind of overlooked knowledge that defines the intelligent survival mindset. Not blindly trusting the past, but not dismissing it either. Digging into it, testing it, and extracting what still works. If this kind of deep dive into forgotten techniques and real-world applications is what you're here for, make sure you subscribe and stay connected. Share this with someone who actually values practical knowledge, not surface-level tips. Because the most valuable survival tools aren't always new. Sometimes, they've just been waiting for someone to take them seriously again.